Welcome to Mana's Seal YouTube channel. The previous video link is on the description box or on the top right card. Volume 13, The Paladin of the Holy Kingdom. The demi-human army made their move during the day. Nia hurried to finish up her porridge. Said porridge was made of oat grains boiled with milk and served in a wooden bowl. Thanks to the winter air outside, it was cold by the time it reached Nia's hands, and, frankly speaking, it was awful. However, if she did not eat, her body would not be able to endure the extended exertion it would have to go through afterwards, and there would be no more food waiting for her. In addition, while there was supposed to be a relief shift for her, Nia had the feeling that she would not be successfully relieved, and that she would be too busy for a proper meal later on. That was why they had been given such a large portion for lunch. She forced the spoon into her mouth, forcing herself to swallow the thick white clumps of oatmeal that were swollen with milk. The sheer amount she had to swallow bloated her belly, and the knowledge that this horrible stuff might be her last meal filled her with despair. At the battlements overlooking the demi-human army, Nia curled herself up on a cotton mat. Her grey-colored coat would be her only defense against the winter cold from now on. The militiamen had started eating at the same time as her, but they had not yet finished. Everyone was frowning. Clearly nobody was happy with the taste. That could not be helped. However, their tense expressions were not due to the oatmeal porridge. Their eyes were not looking at the food in their hands, but the demi-humans making their advance. There was no way anyone could be happy or hopeful when looking upon those overwhelming numbers. Then there were those who had once been prisoners. Their taste of demi-human rule had engraved an intense fear into them. They were under so much stress that they were unable to eat. What would the Sorcerer King do under these circumstances? Would he give a grand, spirited speech to heighten their will to fight? Or would he laugh it off? Nia had no idea what heroic actions he would take. Still, even if she knew, she could not emulate him. After all, she was completely different from the Sorcerer King, who was both a hero and a king. Also, it would probably cause problems if Nia said something like relax and don't worry to them. After all, appropriate tension was what drove things forward. Their faces might have been downcast, but there was no sign that they had given in to despair, nor were there any signs that they wanted to flee. There was something about them, something that one could only find in soldiers who had prepared themselves to meet their fate. The reason for that was apparently due to something that one of the militiamen who had been one of the first to be freed from the prison camps had said about the Sorcerer King. It spread through the soldiers stationed at the walls like wildfire. Lives were not equally important. They were unhappy when they heard he had killed a hostage whom the demi-humans were holding. It was a ruthless act that was very characteristic of the undead. However, the people who had been there strenuously insisted that it was not the case. They spoke of how that incomparably powerful Sorcerer King had said, "Even I would become the victim in the face of someone stronger than me." Nia remembered those words too. Back then, he had seemed extremely human, even radiating a tragic stoicism which felt like determination and resolve personified. It was a powerful promise to protect those things which were important to him, and it had a persuasive power to it, which could not be put into words. And then, they thought about what would happen to the people dear to them if they were defeated here. Their fighting spirit was strengthened by a powerful sense of purpose, which said, "I don't want to let my loved ones go through hell again." Had His Majesty considered that things might end up like this all that time ago? If he had not said those words to stiffen the people's resolve, their forces might have lost their morale in the face of the overwhelming army before them, and they might even have dissolved into a rout. Nia had only seen the Holy Queen once. She had almost no idea of her abilities or her character. Still, she was certain the Sorcerer King was superior to her as a ruler in both aspects. Or rather, the Sorcerer King was probably the sort of sovereign who was known as the King of Kings, the highest order of monarch, even among other kings. And here I used to feel that the people of the Sorcerer Kingdom were pitiful because they were ruled by the undead. However, they might have been very lucky now that she thought about it. Those words caught in Nia's throat, did a loop and refused to leave her mouth. After all, it would not be good if the people around her heard them. Just then. Confirmed enemy advance. All hands prepare for battle. A great shout came from the distance. Everyone gulped down their porridge and went to battle stations. If an army which was over 10,000 strong made its move, the air would shudder, to the point where it might even shake the walls of the city. It felt like the oncoming pressure would squash them flat. In fact, Nia's acute hearing had picked up the earth-shaking clamor of an advancing army, and despondent wails rose up from the militiamen. Morale was falling fast. Still, there was nothing Nia could do, and she was not in a position to do anything either. Nia's job was to fill every enemy who entered her range with arrows. Ever since this city had been taken back, she had spent every waking moment practicing her archery when she had not been performing her duties as a squire. She mused that it was thanks to that practice that she had gotten used to Ultimate Shooting Star Super, and she was now able to use it properly. Still, why are the demi-humans attacking now? Attacking at night would be better for them. Do they have something in mind? If the Sorcerer King were here, I could ask him about this. The absence of the magic caster who had walked beside her in front of her for the past month made her feel like there was something important missing from her heart. No. I can't rely on His Majesty for everything. I need to stand on my own 2 feet. Although I'm not sure exactly what the demi-humans are planning, there ought to be a reason for launching their attack in broad daylight. In that case, it would be best not to be careless. As Nia observed the demi-humans from the battlements, the front line of demi-humans drew her attention. Hey, that's... There was an ogre standing 3 meters tall in the front rank. That demi-human carried a massive weapon. It was some kind of ranged weapon that was protected by a wooden shield. It was a ballista. Although it seemed just right for the demi-human due to the latter's massive size, the fact was that they could be used as siege weapons. Many ogres carried these weapons, which ought to have been mounted in place, and they stood in a row. Had they scavenged them from a city and remodeled them for upright shooting? The drums thundered, and the ballistae were prepared to fire. And then, the city walls literally began to shake. The battlements collapsed in some places. While they would have to have been lucky not to take any casualties given the circumstances, luck was with them for now. A gigantic arrow shattered the battlements. It was not so much an arrow as a javelin. A thick javelin that was longer than Nia was tall raced through the air and embedded itself in the walls. At this point, the only word for it was siege weapon. Surely nobody could take a hit from it and survive. The ogres looked like they were preparing for a second volley. You bastards. Nia stared at them. The ogres were far, far away. Given the power of her bow, she could probably hit them at that range. However, its penetration ability would be greatly diminished, and the fact was that she could not practice long-range shooting like this within the city limits. She did not know the range to them, and she was not confident that she could shoot through the ballistae's shields and kill their wielders. That being the case, all they could do was open the gates and fight a pitched battle to kill the ballista team, but that would be an extremely foolish move. In other words, all they could do was keep on taking this one-sided attack. We have to pull back, but if we do, we can't stop the enemy advance. What kind of plan does the brass have? Although the enemy was only shooting so far, they would move to take the walls if the men retreated, and if the enemy seized the walls, then the city was all but lost. They would take control of the stairs leading down from the walls, and force the soldiers around it back to open the gates, in order to let the main body of their forces into the city. All they needed to do was force that sequence of events through by dint of sheer power. There was nothing they could do about it. Even Remedios would have a hard time being surrounded by enemies in a melee. In that case, all they could do was sacrifice their rear guard and flee the city from the east. However, that would probably lead to the situation they had discussed in a previous strategy meeting. They would be harried along the plains, or they would be crushed between this army and the one arrayed against the south. What would the paladin commanding the west gate decide? Would he fall back, or would he fight to the end? As Nia contemplated the matter, a second volley came from the enemy. The walls shook again as the lance-sized projectile struck it. The trembling felt more intense than the last time, and at the same time she heard an unrecognizable sound. Abba. She looked at the source of the sound and witnessed a horrific sight. One of the ballista bolts had shot clean through a wall and impaled a militiaman hiding behind it. Blood bubbled out of his mouth. Several seconds later, the man's twitching stopped, and he collapsed like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The bolt had nailed him to the wall like an insect specimen, and his arms and legs dangled limply downwards. Screams broke out from around her as the men saw the hideous corpse which had suddenly appeared among them. Nia grabbed the necklace which the Sorcerer King had lent her, and bit her lip. That was a fatal wound. No amount of healing magic could cure that. The death of one soldier did not greatly affect their fighting strength. However, the fear generated by his gruesome death infected the surroundings. The thought that they might be next and that there was nowhere safe for them triggered the survival instincts of the men, and their bodies trembled. Under divine flag. Someone cast a spell. The terror coursing through the militiamen was suppressed in that moment. This was the result of using magic to improve their resistance to fear. While the divine spell Ion's Heart provided complete immunity to fear, it was only effective on a single target. In contrast, Under Divine Flag affected everyone in a sphere around the caster. That was why the paladins stood among the militiamen. Don't be afraid. The paladin who had cast the spell shouted, "Take up your weapons to save those who have gone through the same pain as you." Spells and certain special abilities could briefly panic people, but the fear they felt now came from their own hearts. Under the effects of the fear-suppressing spell, the fire blazed anew in the militiamen's eyes. Still, that was simply covering up the actual problem. The important thing was whether they could do anything about the one-sided attack they were taking from the enemy. Otherwise, the only thing that would come of it would be more dead and wounded. However, Nia could not come up with any good ideas. Take cover. The enemy doesn't have unlimited ammunition. They couldn't have brought so much with them. I see, Nia thought. Most of their resources ought to be going to the south in order to provision the army standing off against the southern forces, so was that why they thought that they would not have brought enough ammunition for their weapons here? Still, even a captive craftsman could make a lot of those bolts in a short time, although the crossbows were a different matter. This was a gamble. The third wave came.